Hello, I'm Michael Topham, technical writer for digital photo, and welcome to this first masterclass video which is going to study Photoshop's valuable lens blur filter. It can be found within the list of 11 blur filters and is one of the more comprehensive blur filters on offer for us to use. It's an excellent filter to experiment with when we're looking to create shallow depth of field effects in our images. In this first video, we'll explore the lens blur filter using selections and our start image ribblehead.jpg, which you'll be able to find in the start images folder on the CD. We'll start off by exploring the different controls in the dialog box and see how these can affect the blur in our image. We'll also see how we can use layer masks when we're working with the lens blur filter, which will allow us to brush back the focus in specific areas should we need to. The second video will concentrate on how depth maps can be used with the lens blur, turning real life scenes into miniature ones, which can be great fun, but more on that a little later in the second video. To begin with, we need to load up the start image ribblehead.jpg, so just go into the start images on the CD, pick out this file and then load it up into Photoshop. This image was taken with an aperture of f22, and as we can see, it's currently sharp from front to back. We're going to use the lens blur filter to blur the background and retain the main focus on these textured foreground rocks. Firstly, we need to make sure we can see our layers palette, and if you can't see yours, move up to the menu bar, click on window and make sure you've got a tick alongside layers. Whenever we're applying a blur to an image, it's very important that we create a new layer to work on, so we're not harming our main background layer. To do this, just move up into the menu bar, just click on layer and then go down and click on duplicate layer. I'm going to rename our duplicate layer lens blur, and then once you've done that, just hit OK and you'll see how that duplicate layer has arrived there in our layers palette. Next, we need to tell the lens blur which areas of the image we would like to blur and which areas of the image we would like to keep in focus. And to do this, we need to use selections. Move across into the toolbox and pick out the lasso tool, and then just move up into the options bar and make sure you're set on new selection and the feather is set to 0 pixels. Draw a selection around the area of the image that you would like to blur, and in this example I'm going to make a selection around this background area, cutting across just before these rather interesting foreground rocks. So I'm just carefully using the lasso tool there, just drawing my way across the image and then down and across, and then when we're ready to join that back up, you'll be able to see the marching ants, which is showing the area that you're wanting to blur. Once we've made our selection, it's very important that we feather our selection to ensure that we get a smooth blurred blend between the foreground and the background. If you're running an early version of Photoshop, you can just go up to select in the menu bar, scroll down to modify, scroll across and then go down to feather and type in a feather radius of 70 pixels before hitting OK. If you're using a newer version of Photoshop, such as CS3 or CS4, we can refine our selection edge by going up to select and then down to refine edge. Once you're inside the refine edge, just set your radius to 0 pixels, set the contrast to a value of 10%, and then moving down set the smooth to 1, set the feather to 70 pixels, and then just move the contract and expand slider to the left slightly, and just set a value of -12%. Once you've inputted these values, just move up, hit OK, and the selection will now be feathered, ready for applying the lens blur. With the marching ants still showing around the outside of our image, we can now load up the lens blur dialog box by shooting up into the menu bar, clicking on filter, scrolling down to blur, and then moving across and then going down to the 6th option, which is lens blur. As soon as the lens blur dialog box loads up on your screen, you'll be able to see this large preview over on the left, and this is great for seeing all of our adjustments that we're going to be making. And down towards the bottom left of the screen, we've got all the controls we need for zooming into the image. But it's worth knowing that we can also zoom into the image using the same keyboard shortcuts as we'd normally use inside Photoshop. So if you need to zoom in and check the blur at any time, just hit Ctrl and plus to zoom in, and Ctrl and minus to zoom back out again. Moving over to the right, we've got all the sliders and options to control the lens blur in our selected area, and these are broken down into 5 different categories. At the top, there's 2 preview modes to choose from. The faster generates the quickest preview of our lens blur adjustments. However, if you want a clearer preview that's more accurate to the final lens blur effect, make sure that you select the more accurate preview. Underneath the preview are the depth map controls, and from the source list we can choose depth maps that we'd like to apply. In the second video, we'll study depth maps in more detail and create our own depth map which will appear from this list. To change the in-focus depth of a depth map, we can increase the blur focal distance slider that can be found beneath. But when we're not using a depth map, like in this example, and the source is set to none, this slider will appear in grey. The invert that's also found under the depth map is a handy control to know about, and this lets us invert the area of the image that's affected by the lens blur. So say for example, we didn't fancy blurring the background of this image and fancy blurring the foreground rocks instead. If I ticked the invert there, that would actually allow us to blur the rocks and keep the background in focus. Something that we don't regularly use, but something that's handy just to have it there, just on the off chance. Under the iris, we can take control of the iris shape from the drop-down list. It's worth knowing that an even amount of blades offers worse bokeh effects than an odd amount of blades, so we recommend that you set the iris shape to heptagon, which has 7 blades. The roundness of the iris can be controlled by using the blade curvature slider, also found within the iris category. And then if we go down slightly further, we can see the rotation slider, and this is good to use when you fancy rotating the iris to a new angle. The most important slider in the lens blur filter is the radius slider, which allows us to control the amount of blur in the selected area. The radius can be set anywhere between 0 and 100 depending on how much blur you fancy introducing into the image, but I'm going to settle for a value of around 44 before setting the blade curvature to a value of around 10 and then the rotation to a value of around 40. Moving further down, under the specular highlights, we have control of boosting the highlights in the blurred area, using the brightness and threshold sliders. The effects can be rather dramatic, so make sure that you set the brightness to a value of say 1 or 2 before moving the threshold slider over towards the left to brighten the pixels that you want. I've settled for a brightness of 1 and a threshold of 40. Adding blur can remove digital noise from an image, and at the bottom of the lens blur control panel, we're given the opportunity to add noise back into the image using the amount slider. I've decided that I'm going to add a tiny amount of subtle noise back into our blurred background by selecting the uniform distribution and then setting the amount to 1. So now that we've taken a good look at the different lens blur controls and added a blur to the background of this image, it's worth checking out the before and after by unticking the preview near the top to see our original image, and then just tick it again and we can actually see the blur that we've applied. The lens blur has helped isolate these fantastic textured foreground rocks from the background, and I'm really happy with the blur effect. So to apply it, I'm just going to move up and hit OK. As soon as the lens blur effect has been applied to your image, just hit Ctrl and D to deselect those marching ants. And next, we're going to add a layer mask to help us reveal a little bit more focus around the edges of these foreground rocks. Make sure that you zoom in nice and closely on these foreground rocks by hitting Ctrl and plus a few times and then just hold down on the spacebar to move through the image. Head back into the layers palette and make sure that you're still selected on your lens blur layer, and then move down towards the bottom of the palette and click on the add layer mask icon. This has bolted a layer mask next to your lens blur thumbnail in the palette. Move across into the toolbox and pick out the brush tool before moving down to the bottom of the toolbox and making sure that you've got your foreground colour set to black. moving up into the options bar, set a brush of a master diameter of around 200 pixels, and then move across and then just lower the opacity very slightly down to around 85%. You can then just brush rather carefully around the edges of these rocks just to bring back a little bit of the original focus. If at any stage you make a mistake and want to paint back the blur around the edges of the rocks, just change your foreground colour from black to white and then paint with white into your layer mask and you'll paint back the blur. If you want to refresh yourself with using layer masks, don't forget to turn back to Digital Photo's 2009 February issue on page 54. I'm just going to paint back a little bit more focus around the outside edges of these rocks, so what I'll do is I'll rejoin you in a minute once I've done it. And this is the result after some careful painting into my layer mask with a black brush. I've just brought back a little bit of detail and focus around the outside edges of those textured foreground rocks. To give this landscape shot the final colour punch that it needs, I'm going to make a hue and saturation adjustment layer by just going up into the menu bar and clicking on layer, moving down to new adjustment layer, moving across and then just going down to hue and saturation. Just hit OK when this dialog box comes up and then just move down to the saturation slider and drag this all the way to the left to a value of -100 before hitting OK. Making sure that you're selected on this new adjustment layer in your layers palette that you've just made, we want to change the blending mode of this. So just click where it says normal in the layers palette and change the blending mode of this layer to soft light before just decreasing the opacity from 100% down to 50%. And there we go. We've effectively applied a simple lens blur to our image, and I think you'll agree that the shot now has a lot more impact with its shallower depth of field. Make sure that you follow this technique and experiment with the lens blur filter for yourself to see how effective the final results can be. That's all for now in this video, but don't forget to check out the second masterclass video, which will see how we can create tilt and shift lens effects using a depth map and the lens blur filter. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.